Hi everyone, welcome to Beers with Brownie. We're an international rugby league YouTube show where we like to bring on some important people in the wonderful world of international rugby league and tell their stories. So when we started the YouTube channel, we said that when we hit 1,000 subscribers, we'd send 100 Stevens out to emerging international rugby league nations to help with their development. So thank you so much guys for your support. We've reached the 1,000, we've sent out the balls. As you may have seen, we've got some videos of how these balls are used in certain countries such as Cameroon, Ghana, Vanuatu and so forth. We've got a few more videos to be released soon from Greece, Philippines and Malta. So thanks again for subscribing to the channel and showing your support for International Rugby League. Okay, so I'd like to welcome our guest for this episode. He is the chairman of the International Rugby League Federation, the honorary Mr. Troy Grant. Thanks for coming on today, Troy.
Thanks, Phil, for having me. And Beers with Brownie, been looking forward to this. And Bulla Bulla, because you're wearing a Fiji Barty shirt today. So
excellent. Have you seen a few shows before?
I have, mate, and I just want to compliment you on what you're doing and be able to have a conversation about rugby league from all different angles. I think is really valuable to continue to grow the game and keep that interest up there. So thanks for Beers with Brownie. Excellent,
thank you. So guys, if you're new to the channel, each episode we like to support a beer that supports rugby league. So we've had on the Immortal Pale Ale that supports the Glebe Dirty Reds. We've had on Young Henrys that support the Newtown Jets and so forth. So today we're going with Mountain Goat. So Carlton United Breweries are the official beer sponsor of the NRL. So we're going to support one of the CUB brands today. So we're going with Mountain Goat. So cheers, Troy.
Cheers.
Oh. Cheers. Also, to those new to the channel, every episode I like to wear a piece of International Rugby League merchandise to show my support. So my highest honour in International Rugby League was playing for the Fiji Barty, and there's no higher person in the game than Troy in terms of the International Rugby League space. So I thought I'd wear my Fiji Barty dress shirt today. And just a big shout out to a good friend of mine, Wise Kativarada. He's been recently named the Fiji Barty head coach, and he's relocated from Sydney over to Fiji to help with all the pathways and development going on in Fiji. So Wise, I know you're watching, a shout out to you, and I wish you all the best. Okay, Troy, so my first question, so how did you come to love the sport of rugby league?
Basically from birth. I've been involved in rugby league. I've had some relatives that played in the New South Wales Rugby League competition. Vince Hedges used to be a hooker for Canterbury. He was a butcher by trade and ended up losing his fingers in a work accident. So that finished his rugby league career. My uncles played a lot. Dad played schoolboys, but he worked on a dairy farm, so he wasn't allowed to play on weekends because the farm and looking after the family was the priority.
Yep.
So when I just was growing up, I was just surrounded and immersed in football through the family, attached to Canterbury Bankstown as a youngster, not only through Uncle Vince, but also through Dad was stationed in the police force in that area and was a good friend with Barry Nelson, who was a police officer and also a chairman of the Canterbury Bankstown Rugby League. So from about 5 years of age right through to 1988, I was a passionate Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs man.
Excellent. And did you dabble in any other sports as a kid, or was rugby league always your number one every season?
Yeah, rugby league, like most Australian kids, in the winter, and cricket in the summer was certainly the focus. Where I grew up, outside of Tamworth in country New South Wales and in New England, I lived at a little place called Katingal. So about 1,500 population, small village, school, pub, small bowling club and general store. Swimming pool and a sports oval that only had soccer and cricket. So in the summer it was cricket and swimming in the swimming club, and winter was soccer. We had no access to rugby league there, but we did have a senior team, the Katingal Moonbi Roosters. And I became a ball boy when I was about 7 for the senior boys, and just continued on and ended up debuting at 18 for the club. So from ball boy to playing for my local team was a real privilege, and I didn't actually get to play in competition rugby league until I went to high school and played in Tamworth for my actual school. It was proper schoolboys rugby league back then. We didn't have clubs like you do this day and age. So played for Oxley High against Farrer, High, who are well known in the area, schoolboys rugby league, big university shield
I think
competitors.
Tom Leroy Lards went there, I think. You know, so some players that have gone on to play in the NRL.
Yes, it's a really good nursery. Newcastle Knights have an association now there. They got during the pre-season and do some training and connected into the Group 4 area. Peel High, Tamworth High, lots of rivalries, and then we'd spread out across the northwest through places like Gunnedah, Boggabri, Inverell, Narrabri, Moree, those sorts of locations.
Okay, I've got a little connection to Katingal. So when I'd come back from England, I did 2 years at Australian OzTag, and we did some country development tours, and we did some OzTag clinics at Katingal Primary, and oh gee, they love their rugby league. Might be a small place, but gee, they live and breathe rugby league there.
No, they do without doubt, in the Katingal Hotel. Still, every year I get my old boys shirt out. The polo comes up, and I keep following them on socials to see how they're tracking. They've really grown a lot. Dean Ellison, who was a reserve grader for Canterbury, a good mate I grew up with, he got spear tackled back in the 80s. He came back and coached a local team. Nathan Blacklock's got an association with Katingal in recent years, I think, with the women's team. Chicka Ferguson from Canberra, he married a local girl. And had a fair bit to do with us back in the late 80s. And
oh, wow.
So there's been some people, the Heaney boys. Anthony Heaney was an Australian schoolboy out of Tamworth. He played in the Group 4 top level with Tamworth City Lions before they merged with the West Robins, and then eventually he came back to Katingal as the Group 4 contracted. Basically, he doesn't have the 2 levels anymore. It's pretty much just the 1 level competition. So it is a thriving rugby league area, and lots of passionate rivalries there. Katingal and Bendemeer, fierce rivals. Dungowan, absolutely. North Tamworth, Bears, fierce rivals. And I made my debut against North Tamworth back in 1988. So against a lot of the Cutmore boys, Joe Craigie, who was a famous name in the area, and played against the Boomerangs also, who had a lot of the McGrady boys. Ewan McGrady's younger brothers are around my age. So
Canterbury Bankstown legend.
He was a legend, and I dare to say that a lot of his brothers, particularly Troy McGrady, was probably a better footballer than Ewan. Just wouldn't leave the bush and go to the city. So plenty of great footballers in my era. Steve Martin, former Manly halfback, an Australian halfback, was coach of Wests at the time. Bruce Sinclair, David Brooks, came out of Tamworth City Lions, went on to play for Balmain, obviously, in the 80s. So it's a pretty good nursery for rugby league. It's lost its way in the last few years, like a lot of country areas have, but a lot of heritage there.
So Troy, tell us about, as a player, what position what positions did you play growing up? So
in schoolboys I was a lock second row. I was reasonably quick and probably would have been considered an edge forward in today's game in schoolboys. Sort of had a running gait a little bit like Peter Wynn, sort of high running style and head back sort of thing. So, but my main forte was defence. Just loved tackling. But I was pretty tall and normal sort of size as a schoolboy. But then it took a while before I got a growth spurt. So when I debuted in men's, in seniors at 18, I was a fullback. Debuted on the fullback, played a bit of wing and centre, but mostly fullback, and I was reasonably quick back then, and just loved it. That was probably fullback and right side wing was probably my 2 favourite positions in seniors.
Okay, excellent. And you were saying you're connected with the Canterbury Bulldogs club. Who were your idols growing up?
Look, I was really fortunate. We had the glory years. Started in the 70s, really, in those early grand finals with St George, and I know we lost in 79, which was a bit devastating. But then to come back and famously win in 1980 with that Greg Brentnell bomb for Steve Gearin. So Greg Brentnell was a bit of an idol of mine. You couldn't not love the Mortimers. They
legends.
were absolute legends of the game. And as I got into my teenage years, I started to look further afield for role models. And Wayne Pearce became my sort of high school role model, I guess, in the 80s. He was the guy I most admired and loved watching from an individual football player, but always backed every one of the Canterbury boys right throughout high school.
So Troy, for those that don't know, can you give the viewers a bit of an overview about your professional background?
Yeah, sure. So I left school at 18 and left home as well and joined the police force. So Dad was a police officer, quite a bit of law enforcement history in my family. Mum was a nurse and lived in a bit of a dysfunctional household. Mum and Dad both had some significant health issues going on, and just Tingle and Tamworth was pretty small back in the day. So
Yeah.
I think like a lot of ones just wanted to get out and explore the world a bit. So joined the police, went to the Goulburn Police Academy, did my 6 months of training, and then I got posted to Western New South Wales at a little place called Gilgandra, which is north of Dubbo.
Right.
Dubbo's a massive rugby league area in the country and pretty successful. We've got the Peachies,
Matty Burton.
Matty Burton went to school with my kids.
All right.
So did Katoni Stags. So there's a few in that era around my kids' ages, and I remember them through the junior ranks there. But Dean Pay, Andrew Ryan, David Gillespie's,
Wow.
Mark Soden's, Russell Richardson's, and generations before, the Sings and Perry's played for Balmain. So
Wow.
lots of footballers from not just Dubbo but even the Western Plains, Central West area have been hugely successful. Jack White out of Orange, just down the road.
Yeah.
Plenty of footballers in that region, so very strong. So
Yeah.
joined the police, got posted to Gilgandra, and it was my intention to play for Gilgandra Panthers in the Group 11 Country Rugby League competition. Was playing a trial match early in the season and snapped my knee in 1989. So that set me back because I then had 3 knee reconstructions in consecutive periods, 2 in the one season. Just came back too early. Medical science wasn't what it was, and my rehab wasn't good enough, and
Same
paid the
knee?
price. Yeah, my left knee.
Wow.
So
like similar to Adam Dewey, 3 on the same knee. Wow.
Yeah, but
Wow.
and different damage every time. So ultimately, during that layoff, it was critical I kept my health for my work as well, being a police officer, and didn't want to jeopardise my probation period. So took a bit of a back seat from playing, and then turned my attention to refereeing. So I got my referee's ticket and did a lot of schoolboys rugby league refereeing in the Group 11, Group 14 areas. And given that I was a police officer, and I used to get asked to go and referee a lot of the Indigenous matches out there, having the communication skills and relationship with some of the Indigenous communities to be able to control the match, keep the crowd under control as well as the play on the field. So got a lot of really good experience refereeing from there, and it ultimately, when I couldn't come back and play, so I then did my right knee, so that was 4.
Gosh.
4, and that was the end of my playing career. So did that playing rugby, trying to come back on a bit of a more social scene, but big mistake.
Right.
And so I just then focused on refereeing and ended up refereeing for I think about 18 years, right throughout New South Wales Country Rugby League, and ultimately in the QRL and the Border League, and just wherever I was stationed police-wise is where I ended up refereeing, and
Right. Okay.
yeah, really enjoyed it.
And when did you leave the police force?
I left the police force in 2011 when I was asked to go into Parliament, run for Parliament. Previous to that, when I was stationed at Walgett, the Country Rugby League approached me to set up a rugby league competition called the Barwon Darling Alliance. So it was the former Group 15, partly Group 14 competitions that had folded. A lot of violence related to the spectators at the grounds. The referee had got stabbed out there, and there wasn't any governance in that. So with my policing background again and experience in league, the CRL came and asked me to set this competition up, which was in 2000, and so I did that. So I was the administrator for the competition, refereed, and ran the competition in all facets.
Did it all?
Yeah, it was a one-man show, but had a couple of helpers, and
Yeah.
I set it up like a magic round. Essentially, every week we just take all the teams to a different town.
Right. Okay.
Control the gate, so there was money coming in to make and no money was getting pinched, and the governance was set up.
Keep the competition sustainable.
Yeah, made it sustainable. Got some sponsors on board, and got it going, and had it all set up. And I transferred out at the end of that year for work and handed it all over. And the competition, I'm really proud to say, is still going 23 years later. And yeah, just a nice legacy to have, and to see what you start if you put the right governance arrangements and right parameters around how you set it up and pathways and that, then you can have long-term success.
Excellent. Well, Troy, before we move into the International Rugby League side, just tell us about what was life in Parliament like?
Yeah, it was an amazing experience, a massive privilege to be voted by the community to represent them in a very historic building, doing important stuff at the state level. So it was a state parliament. You know, we're responsible for hospitals, nurses, teachers, health, police, courts, everything that people rely on day to day. You know, your federal government's more, you know, national security and welfare systems and bigger, bolder national focused things, but the day-to-day stuff is really controlled by what the states do. So
Right.
to make sure you're trying to get their needs addressed is important. We had massive health problems in the Dubbo electorate
Right.
at the time, so I built 6 hospitals in 8 years while I was out there.
Wow, fantastic.
Some new fire stations, police stations, not without controversy, not without some difficulty and challenges. The New South Wales Parliament's known as the Bear Pit, so it's fairly acrimonious. It can be pretty nasty, and you need a bit of tough skin to survive some of it. And
I was going to say, you'd have to have thick skin to be in Parliament, wouldn't you?
you do, and you know, I rose very quickly through the ranks. I got promoted on the first day as a parliamentary secretary, which is like an assistant minister.
Wow.
I was in the cabinet within 4 years. I was deputy premier 6 months later.
Wow.
Led a party to a successful election outcome and was in cabinet until I retired. And so I had some major portfolios. It seemed everywhere I went, big things happened. I was at the Linseed Cafe. I was part of that.
Wow.
Crisis centre. The murder of Curtis Cheng at the police headquarters in Parramatta. I was the police minister when that happened.
Wow.
As well. Just lots of big reforms, and famously was the racing minister during a massive time of investment, and secured $250 million in tax relief for the racing codes and Racing New South Wales. And how I got to meet Peter Volandes benefit from that cash injection. He was able to showcase thoroughbred racing there, and harness and greyhounds also got it. And
Right.
and then we had some massive controversy with the greyhound ban policy that we took, and was rejected outrightly, and lots of really unpleasant times, death threats and pressure on families, and some really horrible period there that we went through, in which was ultimately a decision that was reversed, but the resentment stayed, and still continues with a few to this day. But so you don't get forgiven for mistakes in politics very easily. They don't give you any credit for what you do, and they give you no forgiveness for any mistakes you make. So
Always
it's a bit of a
highlighting.
tough gig.
Always highlighting the bad things, and you know what, you might do 6 good things and 1 bad thing, but they'll highlight the bad thing type of thing.
Yeah, it's the nature of politics, and it's a thankless job, so you don't do it for the thanks, you just do it knowing that you've made a contribution to hopefully make people's lives better and get better services. And after 8 years there, I thought I'd done enough. I'd done what I'd set out to do, and moved on.
Okay, excellent. Well, what a you've done a lot in your professional career. So yeah, it's fantastic. So thanks for sharing. As we now know, you're the chairman of the International Rugby League Federation. Have you always been a lover of international rugby league? Because you get those fans that might be the one-eyed, I support South Sydney Rabbitohs and that's it. Have you always been someone that loves the game and wants to see it grown in new regions? Yeah,
without doubt. Probably the first question about being a lover of the international game, absolutely. Used to get up in the early hours of the morning. ABC, I think, was that, or you could see the footy on back in the days. But
the kangaroo tours.
Yeah, and I remember, the KB logo, because beer's a theme of your podcast, on the kangaroo shorts, and watching Kerry Bowstead and Steve Rogers and some of those guys just light up England back in the 70s, and then the famous kangaroo tours that came around, the Immortals and the Invincibles, and it's just, I just loved it, and particularly because you just got to see players that you just never ever got to see from England, primarily the Kiwis to a lesser degree, but because some of them started to come in, Olsen Filipana, and then the Sorensen boys back in my youth.
Yeah.
But you never saw any Englishmen really until the late 80s, when they started to come over and play for Balmain, the Lee Crooks, Gary Schofields, Ellery Henleys. You got to see them a bit.
Yeah.
Andy Couriers, but the English were sort of out probably 2 decades before that. The famous guys, Malcolm Reilly, and a few others, way before my time. So just to see them, and even France was still okay back in those days. They were a lot stronger, and they dropped off. So yeah, absolutely loved it. I really didn't understand how broadly rugby league was played, even at community or amateur level, internationally, until I got right into the role. But just to have embraced the opportunity that it presents to get our great sport played by as many people worldwide as we can.
Excellent. Well, just a sort of a personal note. So remember the Coca-Cola World Sevens? And I used to love watching the teams like Russia come out against American Samoa and Morocco versus Lebanon, and I just thought, wow, that sort of pulled me for my love of international rugby league, and like seeing where the games come from there back in the early 90s to where it is now, where we have fantastic World Cups. It's great to see, but like it really opens your eyes up. You get to see some players that you wouldn't see, and like in the recent World Cup, the Greek rugby league team had players from the Greek domestic competition. So like things like that, it's just fantastic, isn't it?
Oh, without doubt, and the aspiration to continue to from some nations to ensure a certain number do come from the domestic leagues is important. It's hard because it makes it hard to compete against the full-time professionals, but I think it's the right thing to do ultimately. I don't think there's one right rule, but certainly they've got to be commended. The Greeks were fantastic. You just saw the joy, and having got the chance to meet them over there, you just could sense how joyous they were to be there. Same with the Jamaicans. They just had a wonderful time, and I think it was just great. Forget the scoreboard results, but people talk about they shouldn't be there because of the massive score line margin. Tonga in their first World Cup got beaten by 70, so we had to give up on them. Where would we be as a game now? So
exactly, and people say that argument. Why do we want to see a 90-point win? It's all about the development and crossing over codes for a second. Like Japan lost to the All Blacks 145-0 or something, and then Japan ended up beating South Africa in about 3 World Cups later. So you know what I mean? Like you've got to give these teams time to build and to experience against that type of level as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brownie, that people, I think it's just a societal things now that we're all worried about the destination and we forget that there's a journey to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And we've got to invest and care more about the journey than caring more about the destination, I think, because the destination will come if you do all the right things along the journey.
Excellent. So Troy, we've touched on, you've always been a lover of international rugby league. So you're now the chairman of the International Rugby League Federation. How did you come to fall into international rugby league in terms of getting a role?
Yeah, a little bit by accident. So I had a relationship with a fair few people in the National Rugby League, New South Wales Blues in particular, through my political time. So I was a really big advocate about the lack of investment the NRL were doing in country rugby league. I was starting to get frustrated because Dubbo, as I said, was a major rugby league centre, but AFL had moved in there. Don't get me wrong, I love all sports, so I'm not anti any sport. I love them all, but I just saw that one sport was dying on the vine, whilst a little bit of investment was making a sport that no one had played or heard of out there suddenly dominate the local back 3 pages, sports pages.
Yeah.
So I had a meeting at the time with Shane Richardson, who was working inside the NRL. He'd previously been at Penrith and later at South Sydney.
Yep.
And obviously he'd spent time in the Super League. And together we designed what ultimately is now the NRL matches that go out to the country.
Fantastic.
So I got a bit of an opportunity there. I was pretty critical of John Grant at the time and David Smith and later Todd Greenberg, and I was often invited to Country Rugby League awards ceremonies and or matches, and I would just continually advocate, and not in a nasty way, but just point out the obvious. And at Mudgee, at the very final game of City Country, I was really dirty because I love that fixture because I understood what it meant to country people. And like the International Rugby League, Country Rugby League essentially is run by volunteers. And if you thumb your nose at what the volunteers want, you lose them, then you lose the game. You lose the grassroots, you lose your nursery.
100%.
You lose that volunteer effort, the game's got no future. And I don't think that's respected or appreciated enough. And the city-country clash, whilst it was inconvenient for the professional clubs, and I totally understand their rationale and their reasons, but at the time I remember going on radio and Des Hasler pulled Josh Jackson out of this fixture. He was going to captain country in front of his home family and friends.
Yeah.
He wouldn't let him play. So I went on radio and absolutely blasted Des Hasler, and I said, you know, Des, you got the opportunity to play City in this fixture, and what did it mean to you? What did it help in your career? What did it help make you become the person you were and all that?
Yeah.
And you're depriving another person of that same opportunity you got. I just think it's wrong.
I agree.
So I was pretty vocal on that, and the more vocal I got, the more opportunity I got to speak on it. And
Right.
I was equally critical of the Country Rugby League, who, you know, were some friends of mine. Some of them have passed on now, Jock Colley and Terry Quinn in particular.
Yeah.
But when Rugby League in Australia celebrated its centenary, it named its 100 players. I used to ask them the question, how many of those players come from Country Rugby League? Two problems. A, they didn't know, and they should have known.
Yeah.
And so I told them it was 52 out of the 100 came from the country.
Yeah.
So more than half of your best ever 100 came from the bush. Yet there was no equivalent investment to continue that pathway, that nursery. And the game will ultimately suffer, and there's been a massive shift in the Pacific Islands now, and I think the representation's in the 40-odd percent, in late 40s in the NRL, and which is fine. But everything's got a life cycle, it's got an end date, so to give up on an area or to reduce that investment for other purposes, I just think's a fool's errand, and I used to call it out, and hopefully, I don't think the tide's changed, but I know it's certainly in the consciousness of the administrators now, and hopefully more and more is going to be done.
Excellent. Well, yeah, just to touch on what you were saying there, I'm a massive fan of taking games to the bush. Like, I think, you know, when the Raiders Dolphins go out to Wagga, you know, I went to a game in Tamworth, which was Warriors versus Knights. The whole town comes out. You know, surrounding towns come in. It's massive. You know, it gives a buzz about rugby league. It just does so much. Like, and I think the Sharks are taking a game to Coffs Harbour. So yeah, absolutely think, you know, we should be doing more of it. And you see the 6 o'clock time slot for the NRL games. For Sydney, that's really hard to get to for a lot of workers. That, you know, they might not even leave the office till close to 6 o'clock. Where it might be, say, Bulldogs versus Cowboys at a core at 6 o'clock. You know, it's great for TV, but if you took that to the bush, where you're not going to have the city traffic and whatnot. So is that something like that's been spoken about that you know of? You know, like if you took a 6 o'clock game to Tamworth, everyone can get there. If you take that 6 o'clock game to a core, you know, it's going to restrict a lot of people. Is that something that was talked about?
Not specifically with me, but I've heard commentary. I think Nick Politis is probably the most outspoken, the chairman of the Roosters, on this, that we don't have a rugby league draw, we have a TV schedule.
Yeah, right. Yep.
So, which is fair enough to agree. They're the ones that
they pay the bills.
Yep. They're the ones that put the big money up. So, and they've got to sell. And, you know, there's a whole science behind it. You know, the time slot's important to them to generate revenue in order for that revenue to then be passed back on. So it's an economy. There's a communications media economy out there they have to satisfy.
Yeah.
As well as trying to get the balance right to satisfy the fans and ground attendance and all that sort of stuff. So it's not easy, and I have some sympathy there. But the thing that's always frustrated me, and back to the allocation of the games that you said you saw the Warriors and Knights play in Tamworth at Scully Park. I used to play on Scully Park a fair bit in my day. It's fantastic. But when they were first allocating who was going to play where, they had it all muddled up. They didn't even understand their fan base. And the South Sydney versus the Dragons match that went to Mudgee was only because I explained to them that they had a massive fan base out there. And they had no idea, and because I think there was 4 matches, so 8 teams in the original rollout.
Yeah.
And they were trying to work out what went where, and I said, well, Melbourne and Canberra have got to go to Wagga. It geographically makes sense. It's in Canberra's catchment area.
Yep.
So you sort of got a home team. It's accessible for Melbourne fans to get to. It makes sense that way. And I said, you've got to take Souths and St George to Mudgee, because the fan base out there is massive. the teams are named the Dragons and Rabbitohs out in that region.
Yeah, Mudgee
as
Dragons.
well.
Yeah.
Mudgee Dragons.
Yeah.
Walgett Dragons. Wilcannia Rabbitohs. Westside Rabbitohs. Like, this is a couple. There's more that are like that too.
Yeah.
And they just didn't get it. Their IQ on that was really disappointing, I think, and pretty poor. So
Right.
you can't forget the fundamentals of the game, and you can't forget the core structures and the mechanics of how it all works, why it works, the volunteers, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
You forget that pass, you do it at your own peril ultimately. And when we drove to the first game, I was with a couple of officials. They were lined up for kilometres, all wearing South Sydney and Rabbitohs gear. And the official said to me, "Wow, you were right, Troy." And I just thought, well, we live out here, you know your area, you just know it. I said,
Yeah.
it's not rocket science. You just need to get your head out of Sydney, you know, and think more broadly and understand your own product better.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the bush country rugby league is so important to our sport, and we definitely need to nurture it.
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely.
So Troy, we're going to move on to the 2021 Rugby League World Cup. So obviously, as we know, it got pushed back a year through COVID. So tell us your thoughts on how it all went. Were you happy with the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you can look at these events from different lenses, I guess. So if I could, I just want to explain the IRL to people who have an expectation of us as an organisation that doesn't quite match with reality or the history of the place.
Right.
So we're at the International Federation's head body, but we have a full-time staffing of 2 people. Then we have some contracted volunteers. There's an expectation of IRL that we dictate what happens, but we don't. We're a member organisation, so the members themselves, being the nations, that whether they're a full member, affiliate or an observer, have certain rights, obligations to run their governance, grow the game domestically, and that sort of stuff. But what they do so far as content is up to them to decide. We can't force a nation to play someone else or force them to play when or whatever. They've got to be able to come to that arrangement with their own capacity if they're able to do it, and in agreement with other nations. The only thing that the International Rugby League owns and can dictate is the World Cup.
Right.
So the men's, women's and now wheelchair, and then the World Nines, which has only had the one incarnation.
Right.
And we have a qualification process that we govern, but it's actually then run by confederations as well. So it's not run by us either.
Right.
So when it comes to the World Cups, because we've only got a staff of 2, the model is that bids will come in for organisations, whether it's been entrepreneurs have tried in the past, whether it's actual leagues like the RFL on the 21 occasion.
Right.
They bid to have the World Cup. They then set up a commercial entity called a joint venture, where they set up a company to operate the World Cup.
Right.
An agreement's made that the IRL gets a staging fee, so they pay a rights fee to hold it, and then the running of the World Cup is distant from the IRL. I'm not saying that's the right model. I actually don't think it's a very good model at all for us, because
Right.
there's a lot of risk in it. We don't get any control over sure things are done properly.
Yeah.
And we're starting to change that now that we've got independent directors on board. They're bringing different experiences. So to answer your question, so from the point of view that this was a success, it's the first time our 3 disciplines had been held together, men's, women's and wheelchair.
Yeah.
And that was the first for world sport.
Wow.
So I think
Excellent.
from that point of view, from an inclusivity point of view, for a promotion of our sport to the reach and impact it had, absolute success, massive success, world first, beautifully executed, and on the ground after the final, when the 3 teams came out with their trophies and all that, it had an Olympic feel to it. It had a festive, joyous feel to it, and
Yeah.
everyone on the ground, the officials, I heard the referees saying, I just heard people, the players were saying, this is amazing, this is so special, it's something that hasn't happened in rugby league before. How do you put a value on that? How do you bottle that and take that to the next event is a trick and a challenge.
Yeah.
If you look at it from a pure tickets revenue point of view, no, not as successful as it could have been. There's a culture that I've learnt in England where the fan wait for last minute cut price ticket sales,
deals
and deals and package deals and things like that. Well, that wasn't the business model that World Cup took. They offered all those at the front end. This is pre-COVID, so there were some great deals on.
Yeah.
But the market in England were late buyers, late turner-uppers. They get those last deals, which weren't on offer.
Right.
Which I think had an impact on ticket, just the buying patterns.
Right.
In addition to that, cost of living over there, like
Yes.
seriously, I'd fill up my car and I was just astounded how much it cost.
And the gas prices have gone up, for heating and all that sort of thing. So yeah.
So people were making a choice about whether they pay the electricity bill or they bought a ticket to the World Cup.
Yeah.
And you can't just ignore that as an impact. It's not anybody's fault. It's not the World Cup's fault. It's not the RL's fault. It's just the economic circumstances at the time that the conflict in Europe was having, and the runoff. So was that ideal? Was that a financial success? Ticket sales, no. Investment from commercial partners and sponsors, absolutely. We had more sponsors and commercial revenue come in than we've ever had before, and from brand new people who'd never invested in the game before. So
excellent.
Big tick in that. The problem is when you add all that up together, with the postponement, I think we've calculated the postponement cost the tournament around £11 million. We were lucky that we had wonderful support from the UK government, and they have essentially covered off on that what would have been a loss to make sure that the tournament met budget. So the tournament's met budget and was been able to pay its bills, and they're still finalising accounts that take some months after an event in just normal circumstances, and debtors and creditors, all that sort of stuff. So that's the process still ongoing. But yes, it was a financial success because we got our rights fee. No one's bankrupt or whatever. They've met budget. That's but yes, it unfortunately probably could have been an £11 million better outcome had we not had the postponement, the pandemic and the economic crisis.
Which was, out of everyone's control. So
exactly.
Yeah. I was just going to go touch on the inclusivity, Troy. I love the fact that it was men, women and wheelchair. The pay for each player was equal. After living in London myself for 10 years, I crossed every walk of life, people that never heard of rugby league before to Aussies that live and breathe it. And I know the wheelchair game played a number of games in London at the Copper Box Arena. Mm-hmm. And I saw friends on Facebook who weren't traditionally rugby league fans that captured their hearts and minds. So it was winning new fans over, and it was great to see. I just saw some comments about, never seen wheelchair rugby league before, but I'm a massive fan now. So in terms of, when you say measure success, I think it won a lot of new fans over.
Without question, I had the massive privilege of meeting the Princess of Wales at Wigan. And everyone says, what did you talk about? And the first question was, I was introduced as the chairman, and am I happy with the tournament, how it's going? And I said, I'm really pleased and grateful for the efforts of everybody. And she said, what's been your favourite part of the tournament so far? And I said, the wheelchair. And she leant forward, and I'm just the greatest admirer of the Princess of Wales. I think she's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
But she, when you meet royalty, and I've had the privilege to meet quite a few over the years, there can be a real stiffness and a very formal protocol in certain aspects, and then if you can break through that or you have that opportunity, then it's quite a warm exchange you have with them.
Yeah.
And I found out when I met the now King and Queen Camilla back in Sydney years ago, that we did our formal stuff, then we sat down during an event, and it was quite a casual conversation, lovely and warm.
Excellent.
And she was like that because she leaned into me and said, I just love the wheelchair. I sat with the kids and we watched England and the Wheelaroos play.
Wow.
And she was fascinated, and that's all she wanted to talk to me about was the wheelchair rugby league.
Fantastic.
So new fans, biggest fan, Princess of Wales. She and the royal family, they watched it and then watched all the games after it. Just absolutely loved it.
Excellent. That's very pleasing to hear that. That's fantastic. Troy, I just wanted to, just before I move on to some other questions, I want to go back to when you said World 9. So that's a property that run by the International Rugby League, and that's sort of near and dear to my heart because the World 7's that started my love for the international game. Has there been any updates on the next World 9s? Is it going to continue? The first one was at CommBank. Was it 2018 from memory?
2019.
2019.
Yeah.
So is there going to be another one coming up soon?
Yeah, this is all part of that wonderful question that I know all your fans will get to it, is the international calendar. So absolutely, it's a part of our future plan. So, and just to clarify too, so we have a World Cup of Nines. It's not World Nines because that's actually intellectual property that is owned by the late Paul Broughton and his wife Beverly Broughton.
Right.
So World Nines is actually a brand, and it's World Nines Confederation Cup. So it's a Nines tournament that is for emerging nations, amateur players, which was originally scheduled for 2020 in Samoa, and again COVID affected. So we're now working with Bev on a new venue, which we hope to be Fiji.
Okay.
And that'll be a World Nines, which we're then hoping that will then also help with our Olympic bid to have Nines in the Olympics,
Yep.
and potentially act as a qualifier for the World Cup of Nines that the IRL owns. So
Right.
absolutely, it's on the agenda as part of the calendar. It's about the placement of the calendar that's important, and I've had some discussions with Peter Volandis and Clint Newton just within the last fortnight in relation to that. As everyone knows, they're trying to finalise their CBA,
Yeah.
Centralised Bargaining Agreement, and the last thing they need to finalise is a concept that hasn't been there before, is about international payments coming out of a central pool rather than it being responsibility of the nations.
Yeah.
And that's for events that are run by the NRL
Right.
in the Southern Hemisphere. So
Okay.
I'm not party to those. Both parties have briefed me on their position, and they don't seem that far apart, but we're hoping for a quick resolution because it is holding up the calendar. Because whilst we've drawn it up and it's on a piece of paper, and I've got my laptop here, I could show you,
Yeah.
we have to make sure that each of the fixtures we've put in there are viable, are commercial, can be afforded and paid for. Because if we put a calendar out of content that doesn't materialise, then we look foolish, we look amateurish. So it's frustrating. There's been delays and delays.
Yep.
But there's a lot of moving pieces you've got to bring together to make that happen. So yes, the World Cup of Nines is absolutely a critical part of our future calendar.
Excellent.
The placement when you actually play that, in my view, is probably the year after the bigger World Cup. And people will say, why would you have back-to-back World Cups? Why wouldn't you spread them out a couple of years apart?
Yeah.
Well, the reality is a World Cup takes up a massive chunk of the professional players' time period, when it impacts on leave entitlements, it impacts on growing pre-season commitments.
Yep.
So it then impacts on player loads, welfare for the players, etc.
Yeah.
If you follow up the following year from a big 6 to 7 week World Cup, where players could be there for that period of time, with a short and potentially 2 weekend event, then that player load and impacts a lot less, and allows then the other 2 years before the next World Cup to be focused on regional content in the hemispheres, tours, kangaroo tours, lions tours, other sort of concepts, tri-nations, other events that are part of the calendar as well.
Okay, excellent. And sorry, just again, before I move on, I want to touch on what you said in regards to the International Rugby League have 2 staff members now. So going back, this is probably about 2003, 2004, I did my internship with Taz Batiri, who was working partly with the New South Wales Rugby League, partly with International Rugby League, and at the time he was the only staff member for International Rugby League. I think moving forward to about 2013, we appointed Dave Collier, was it, as the CEO of International Rugby League, and then Nigel Wood became the CEO of International Rugby League. So who works for International Rugby League now, just for the people that are not aware?
Yeah, so the 2 employees, we have a Secretary General, Denny Kazanzajan,
Yep.
based in France now,
Right.
and Charlotte Monkman, who's based in England. She's our projects and governance person, and both outstandingly committed, both do a terrific job.
Excellent.
Then under contract we have someone that does our finances, so we've got an accountant that comes in. We have a legal person, Brad Walter, who's employed by NRL, is also on contract to the IRL for our media, and we have a digital person in Sarah Piper,
Right.
under contract. So all wonderfully dedicated people who do more than they get paid for, really. So it is a small enterprise.
Yeah.
I think the challenge for us, and when the IRL underwent governance reform and brought on 3 independent directors, which I was one of in January of 2020, it was to try and take the business from essentially like a shelf company that was a representative body by way of a board, and actually make it an operational organisation, not grow it to mammoth sizes, because it doesn't need that. We've got 2 properties, we've got lots of World Cups, and then we've got some people that need to do governance. So stage 1 of the governance review for the IRL essentially happened in 2019, that allowed for the 2020 inclusion of independent directors, and I think there's another incarnation of that needs to happen, and we've got our first face-to-face meeting in July,
Right.
where that's the number 1 topic matter. What does the IRL need to look like to make our World Cups in the future as successful as possible? Make sure there's coordination and consolidation of events populated by the way of a calendar, and just make sure there's proper strategic growth projections and strategies that are all linked and make sense. Because our number 1 strategy at the moment is to regrow the game in France,
Yep.
and to help them potentially set up a professional league there. So was part of our thinking for France being the host for the World Cup in 25. So.
Okay, excellent. And we'll touch on that shortly as well. But just a World Cup question I had, Troy. So 2017, I was part of the USA Hawks off-field staff. Wonderful experience. We were based in Townsville for 2 weeks, went up to Port Moresby. Port Moresby was amazing, because the way that they love rugby league there, it's like you're a movie star. Like we had kids chasing our bus. Like it just showed you how much rugby league means to people. It's wonderful to see. But my question is, so we saw the rise of Tonga, and it went down to the wire. Came back against England. We saw Fiji have a wonderful World Cup, making their 3rd semi-final in a row at a World Cup. Would we ever consider, because I just thought the momentum of Tonga was going so well, if Tonga played Fiji in a 3rd place playoff, like you see it in FIFA World Cups and Rugby Union World Cups, would we ever consider that as a potential match, a 3rd place playoff game at a World Cup?
No. And the reason, I know the aspiration, I understand why it would be good and attractive and exciting, is that we don't control the number 1 asset, which is the players. And the reality is that the large percentage of them are professional athletes who are employed by a club, whether it be in the Super League, whether it be in the NRL competition.
Yeah.
So to have them for a fixture that, in club's view, didn't mean something of significant, the risk-reward argument comes in, and the risk of injury and then the flow-on impact to the club would be too great for them to support it.
Yeah.
It then would keep them there longer, which would impacts on their ability to take their leave under their enterprise agreements. To have them longer adds additional cost. Would you get enough revenue to cover off on the additional cost of accommodation, and that for the period of time they'd have to extend their stay. So, yeah, look, romantically, you can see how it would work. The practicality and pragmatism around it probably doesn't measure up, as disappointing as that will be for a lot of people. But that's the essential, honest reasons why I don't think it is ever something that will happen.
Okay, well, it makes a lot of sense, and you can understand the reason why it won't go ahead. So Troy, after the success of the World Cup, when we spoke about what the metrics were, so obviously a lot of people were excited about International Rugby League, and they were like, okay, what's next for International Rugby League? At the time of filming, we've recently had England play France last weekend. We've got, I know, just through my contacts, I'm good friends with George Diliano. So George, I know you're watching, so shout out to you over in Athens, over in Greece there. He's working hard behind the scenes to get the Greece-Serbia game going. I saw online there's a Philippines-South Africa game, but that's mainly Australian domestic players with heritage playing on the Gold Coast. We've seen a Tonga versus England 3-game series, which is fantastic. Like, I'm a massive fan of that. So is there any other announcements that are going to be, or maybe it's confidential, but is there any more international games that will be announced soon?
Yeah, there is. So it's been frustrating, without doubt. I'm not sure that our fan base understands how complex and difficult it is to get these matches up and running. It's not just securing the players' availability, because when I became a member of the board, one of the first things I did is I reached out to the NRL and Super League clubs to introduce myself and understand how we could work better in a partnership, because as we touched on earlier, they own the players, essentially.
Yeah.
The players, if you ask them, they played 10 internationals a year, they just love it. It's the international game's the players' game and the fans' game. They just love it.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a balance there properly. And when a club releases a player, they've got to be assured of a few things. The first thing is their players are getting looked after. So the standards about access to doctors and physios and proper care and training methods, decent accommodation, that their health and well-being is looked after. That's number one for the clubs.
Yeah.
Secondly is they're not playing too much. So their player loads and weights and the stress and strain on their bodies isn't going to impact on their ability to play a season with their clubs as their employer.
Yeah.
And the third thing is that the club said they don't want them playing for Mickey Mouse reasons. They want them playing for something of substance, of importance, of stature, with a history, a rivalry, something that means something. So the content can't be thrown together 5 minutes before the event, which has been the Achilles heel of not having a calendar. And it's what, and to their credit, the NRL have led. The only content that has happened has been because the NRL have invested and put it on. The downside is it's never had a chance or been given a chance to succeed because it's been thrown together at last minute because it hasn't been the priority. Running the NRL is a massive undertaking. It's a multi-billion dollar enterprise. Putting a few internationals on, you can understand, isn't for some the priority.
Yeah.
Is for you and me and plenty of our listeners out there.
Yeah.
So, and that's the reason I met with Peter V'landys just recently, and I said to Peter, you're successful with thoroughbred racing, and if you were to put a racing carnival on in the same period of time that you organised internationals, would it be a commercial success? And he said, no, it wouldn't, because you wouldn't have the time to build the story, the narrative around the carnival, make sure that you had all the best talent there in thoroughbred, the trainers, the horses, the jockeys, to make sure their availability was locked in.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have enough time to commercialise it and make it a success. And I said, well, that's exactly what International Rugby League's been facing for the last decade. It's thrown together at the last minute, and that's the number one angst of the clubs.
Yeah, yeah.
So building that relationship, we've got to understand that, and I think we've taken leaps and bounds forward. The World Cup that Josh Papali'i played in for Samoa, he came back completely out of condition and was a terrible impost on Canberra for that season. He was basically no good to them, and he acknowledged that, and it's not being derogatory of Josh in any way, because those standards weren't there. We've come a long way. The Pacific Test last year, the standards were outstanding. I saw them firsthand. I saw them firsthand at England at the World Cup.
Yeah.
So the clubs now have a far more confidence in what's happening in the national space, which is great.
Yeah.
The final thing we've got to do is make sure that the calendar reflects the content that gives them confidence that they're not playing too much, and what they're playing for is a value of worth and is worth that risk reward. Because the clubs benefit out of having internationals in their club. They're able to market that, sell sponsorship and all that, saying we have X amount of Kiwis, X amount of Tongans, X amount of Kangaroos, etc. So there's leverage and opportunities for clubs from the international game, but they need the international game to be of a standard that gives that leverage even more value to them as well, to equal out that risk reward situation.
Okay, excellent. I actually noticed that when an NRL club announces signing and they're an international, they'll say we've signed, Jack Whiten for Rabbitohs. He'll be in an Australian jersey, or Fanua Blake's gone to the Warriors in a Tonga jersey, and I love that. But when the NRL clubs are embracing that international side, which is going to move me onto the international calendar, Troy. So the big one that I'm sure a lot of viewers want to find out more information about. So just a personal experience, 2018, I was living in London, the Denver match. Do you remember the Denver match between England and New Zealand?
Yep.
3 months out, I wanted to book my flights. We didn't know if it was going ahead or not. I ended up booking about 6 weeks out, had a wonderful time. Russell Crowe was there supporting the event. I sat with a bunch of Americans I didn't know, and I was asking them, what do you think of rugby league? Oh, then they loved it. And it was fantastic. But like you say, it was, 3 months out, we didn't know if it was going to go ahead. So living in London, if you're, rugby union's quite big there with the Six Nations. So you could, 2 years in advance where England are going to play Italy, or, so you can book your travel, your accommodation. So the big question on everyone's lips is when do you think an international calendar will come to fruition? So the long, International Rugby League supporter I wouldn't want to say long. I didn't want to say suffering because we've had a great World Cup. But someone that yearns for more international rugby league, when will they be able to know in advance when fixtures will be taking place, more than say 6-month window?
Yeah, this is the question that gets me in so much trouble on social media, I tell you, because my original ambition was to have it released in June last year. That was the target. I've been accused of breaking a promise. I didn't promise anyone that it'd be then. That was all the indications and assurances I got from the membership, and that they were right to sign off by that time.
Right.
Delays happened on their end that didn't allow us to do that. And France being secured as the World Cup host was our priority, so it slipped down the priorities. We had to do the work on France 25. We couldn't go into World Cup 21 in 22 without a host for 25. That would have been a disaster. So they took priority. So then the decision and the assurances I received was that after the World Cup we'd then be able to have it ready for release. So it's been to the board. The board's looked at it. It's designed. It needs some tinkering and needs a little bit more consultation with neighbours, with members and participants, etc., to lock down.
Yeah.
So that was the plan was then. And in that time, the CBA dispute, which should have been resolved, I think August last year, is still going on, and we're in May. That's completely out of our control. So, as I said to an earlier question, if we put out a calendar and it doesn't measure up financially, it's not going to be the calendar for long. It'll get bastardised, it'll get ripped apart, and it'll just detract from the faith anyone has. So, as frustrating as it is, I think we're better off getting it right, doing it once and getting it right.
Yeah.
And we need everything locked away with some certainty as best we can, because we can't control everything, to say that's the calendar going forward, and that'll only give us the opportunity to get better confidence from the commercial sector to invest in all those fixtures and all those games and all that content as well. If people said, why don't you go to a certain country and sell them these fixtures? Well, I can't, because I've got no surety I can guarantee them under the current arrangements. So you can't sell what you don't have, what you don't know, what you don't control. But with a calendar, that'll give us more opportunity and more revenue in. And we're like a not-for-profit. Money we make goes back to the memberships. I don't get paid. The two other independent directors don't get paid. So the IRL's overheads and staff costs and all that are very small for an international federation, because our focus and passion is putting money back into the game. We haven't had that much money in recent years. As our annual report showed, there has been very little content. The books will look a lot better once all the money flows in for the World Cup in this financial year. But no content, no revenue. I think we've done pretty well to keep the lights on and things moving, despite the obstacles out of our control that have been forced on us with global pandemics and postponements and industrial disputes and everything else happening out there that we have no control of. And so a real focus in our face-to-face meeting is to try and take away those things we can't control that actually impact us, and stop being a passenger for so many things as the IRL, where we're often a passenger of other people's decisions or their outcomes or their priorities, rather than being able to be in control of our priorities.
Okay, excellent. So a big part of the calendar moving forward will obviously be the 2025 World Cup in France. So can you give the viewers an update on how it's all going and what it's going to look like?
Yeah, so it's a really big, ambitious target, and the reality is, it's an attitude to be bold and brave, or why you're bothering. The essence of why France was that the previous management of the IRL were nearly negligent to not have secured a 25 host when we came on in 2020. These tournaments really need 5 to 7 years to lead time to get organised properly.
Yeah.
That's just the nature, the size, the scope and scale of them. For us to come in as independent directors and not have a host was automatically saying, we understand why we're here now, and how does this go? Within 8 weeks of us joining, the pandemic hit. So it was like, oh wow, and that's tough times, as we all remember. Even just getting face to face with people to have conversations was impossible, and trying to do everything over Zoom or Teams or those other platforms, WebExes and stuff, it's just not the same, and there's so much uncertainty around. People weren't making commitments and things. So Essentially, on my own initiation, with the help of Wayne Bennett, Trent Robinson, Michael Checker, and a couple of others, we just put together a proposal and a pitch to the French government, and it was to run off the back of the World Cup for rugby in this year, in 23, the Paris Olympics in 24, to hold a trifecta of World Cups in France in 25.
Yeah.
To rebuild the game in France, which is what Wayne Bennett's key message to me was when I first met him as an IRL director.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge with that also is that it takes it to a new territory that hasn't really hosted. I know France were joint hosts in 13, I think it was, with England, of a couple of matches, but
yeah.
Different language challenges, different footy IQs, different landscape that we're dealing with can be difficult. So it was a monumental task right from the get-go. But it also importantly broke the cycle of it just being in England, just being in Australia. We need to take the World Cup elsewhere to new frontiers as well. So the current status is that outside of our control, once again, the French government is in disarray, a lot of turmoil. The parliaments have been shut down. There's been delays on information and revenue assurances coming through to us. There's rioting in the streets, the hostilities, and there's some very, very concerning activities happening. We've been in regular contact with the French government bodies over there, and because of the uncertainty of their area, they're looking at our event, and I'm sure they're doing it with the Olympics and rugby as well, with a different lens of risk avoidance in any situation. And you know, rugby league's not a very well-known sport in France. So the extra scrutiny is going on there, and their risk appetite wasn't what it was. And it's a different government that took on the World Cup than exists currently. So all those sorts of stuff are concerning us. A decision ultimately will be made in July to give absolute assurances about what's happening, how it's happening, etc., and or contingencies if things don't go our own way. And go the way we need it. So will there be something in 25? Absolutely. We're hopeful it's going to be still France in whatever format the circumstances may dictate. Mm-hmm. But we haven't made decisions in relation to that, but we're working every day. I got a letter at 1 a.m. this morning from the French Department of Sports Minister to give us an update. It's just getting translated at the moment, so I'll read that when I get home. But yeah, so that's the current status. That's just the reality and honesty of the situation. It's frustrating again. We're not in control of a lot of that destiny, but we're working really hard to make sure that we, take advantage of the wonderful platform that World Cup 21 gave us, and continue to grow the game and maximise the potential that's there. Yeah. That's the job.
No, definitely. Excellent. Well, no, best of luck with the calendar and the World Cup, and I'm sure it's we're going to have some exciting news in the coming months, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I know what's planned, or what's being planned and constructed, and again, I guess we're a little bit conservative in that we just don't go out and blow hole what we're going to do, and then it falls over and you look foolish.
Yeah.
We make sure it's locked away and squared away before we make the announcements. It's frustrating for the fans because they're desperate to know, and we get that, we understand that, but we want to get it right as well and make sure it's successful. So I can just give everyone the assurance that the calendar for 23 that I'm aware of, that is in the process of being finalised, will excite everybody, and then 24 will similarly excite people. It's great stuff, and then the longer 10 years that follow after that will give everyone what they've been after for a long, long time, and get rid of that Achilles heel for the IRL, and let's make the very best of what is a wonderful product in International Rugby League.
Excellent. Well, Troy, we're coming to the end of the interview. Just one thing, another personal observation. Going back to the 2000 World Cup, I don't know whether you remember. So England played Ireland as a pact. I think it was I thought it was Huddersfield, but from my last episode, Mike Meehall-Wood was saying it was actually Headingley.
And Mike could be right.
Yeah, because he loves the Ireland Rugby League. He calls himself the Irish Rugby League super fan. Shout out to you, Mike. I know you're watching. So I thought it was a fantastic fixture, and it was quite competitive. It was like 8 points or 10 points in it, and Ireland had some heritage players like Ricketson and Campion played. Yeah. Barry McDermott. could we, like, because England are always screaming out that, oh, we want a good opposition, you know, like, well, Tonga are going to come over. France are on the way up, you know, they're not there yet, but they're improving. Can we see like a full strength Ireland versus England again? Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. That's the aspiration, because I've spoken to IMG quite frequently with Matty Wright over there and the RFL. So we're in conversations with Tony Sutton as well as Rodri Jones. So the RFL, I've said to them, need to sort of replicate what the NRL are doing. Tonga and Samoa are largely the products of the NRL's pushing and investment, not what has come from domestically.
Yeah.
Because they're small countries, they have small commercial bases, they have small governments, they don't have a ton of funding. They're relying on grants from larger nations, from Australia, for example, through DFAT funding and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the European Union don't do that sort of thing for some of the countries, or the UK government don't do that as much as the Australian government does in that sort of level of generosity.
Yeah.
So we need IMG and the RFL to step up to, as part of that rebuilding of the region, to, you know, put together some of this interesting content. I think, and I met with Trent Robinson about French rugby league in the future just the other day. They're at Twin Waters, up near where I live, training before Magic Round.
Yeah.
And got to go and watch the boys train, and I sat down with Trent for a few hours talking the future of French rugby league.
Yeah.
And I think he's right when he said to me that for him, the internationals just happened. There was only 4 players in the French team that had professional league experience. There are only 4 from the Super League, essentially.
Because most of Catalans and Toulouse players didn't play, right?
Yeah, which is, well, I was talking about earlier, the difficulty we had with the Australian clubs. They were really on side for our World Cup. The relationship has just changed. There's more private ownership in England, or in the Super League, particularly. So we need to break through over there on the same premise to show them the value of international rugby league for their Super League club side, so that release of players isn't an impact. So I think it was a distorted result for where France really are, but there's an absolute acknowledgement that France need to grow a lot. So does Wales, got massive potential. Ireland.
Yeah.
You know, Scotland's struggling at the moment, but Scotland's got some potential.
Yeah.
But Trent indicated to me, and I think he's right, that there's not going to be the exponential growth needed if they just keep playing each other over there. Mm-hmm. He thinks there's a need for them to tour here, as well as some touring from here over there.
Right.
So it needs some cross-pollination to lift those standards. So France need to be playing Fiji, Cooks and Papua for a number of years, to then graduate to Tonga and Samoa, and then New Zealand, Australia on a more regular basis.
Okay, excellent.
I think that's how you grow, and I think that the same's true. And even if Wales, Scotland, or probably Scotland, came out and toured and played New South Wales country, and the New South Wales residents and Queensland residents teams and things like that come out of the Q Cup and New South Wales Cup competitions, I think it would accelerate and enhance their development at a probably more sustainable level than if you just pitched them in against Samoa straight up. They wouldn't be full test matches or internationals, but I think they're important investments to make in the growth of the nations in the Northern Hemisphere. I think the European Cup, whilst I understand it, I don't think it actually helps in the growth of the competitiveness of the teams there.
Right.
And I just think it's probably too regular. I'm not saying you don't have a European Cup, but I just think the construct and the shape of it is doing nothing to grow the game or increase the capacity of the nations over there.
Okay. Well, just going on France coming over here, it was just before COVID hit. I went and watched over in Parks. France played the Western Rams, and that was great. Packed house. Most of the Parks were there. And then they played in Wollongong as a curtain raiser to Australia, New Zealand.
I was at that match.
And that was great to see France playing Australia A. Obviously, Australia A had like Payne Haas and these type of players.
Kalen Ponga, David Fafita.
But it was good to expose France to these type of players. So no, that's great.
But it was a mismatch, yeah?
Yeah, I think it was.
Whereas the Western Rams.
That was like 32-20 or something like that. France won, I think.
Yeah, so you don't want to put Scotland up against the junior Kangaroos.
Yeah.
Because that's not going to do anything for their development. You play them against the Western Rams or New South Wales country or Queensland country or stuff like that, you're going to get better experience. And Trent, being a brilliant coach, explained it to me this way, that where the development and their learning comes from is the decision making, right? So they get taught and told what to do in training and drills and all that sort of stuff, but until you actively do it and practice these skills and actively do them, it's about the decision making on the field. So if you're a forward, you've got to make some decisions about your defence. If you're going up quickly, or you go up quick or not, or where you target in a tackle, that's all decision making. That's where the development comes from.
Yeah.
Your halfback, your game managers, about where you place the team in certain times of the game to be in certain positions on the field. That's a decision making thing that can only be garnered in competitive environment. Mm-hmm. If you've got France playing Australia, they're not going to get that, because they're just going to be on the back foot the entire game, getting run over the top of, essentially. They're not going to have the opportunity to kick for position, to make decisions. But if they're playing New South Wales country, they'll get more experience in the operational playing of the game. That's where the development comes. And it made a lot of sense. That's why he's one of the top coaches in the world, and France are very, very lucky to have him as a coaching director. And I think that sort of thinking and involvement from other experienced coaches across professional leagues is important for the nations as they grow as well. Excellent.
No, thanks for that answer, Troy. So going on to my last question, we're hearing, we've had the success of the Dolphins, the 17th NRL franchise. So there's talk of where the 18th NRL team will be. I'm hearing, fans want Perth, fans want Adelaide. The government would back a Cairns/Port Moresby team. New Zealand 2 might be an option. If it was your decision, where would you put the 18th NRL team?
Oh, good question. So my wife's a North Sydney Bears fan, so
right.
If she is watching, to say the Bears, and Gareth Holmes is a good mate of mine too. But
been on the show, Gareth. So.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Good guy.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, because the Pacifica team / the PNG potential team, I think is an interesting one. I think it would obviously continue to enhance those nations, but I think they're tracking pretty well from a development point of view anyhow. The PNG Kummels are growing all the time, and their team's largely domestic, but the standard's really raising. They get the PMs13 match already.
Yep.
They've got the Hunters playing in the Q Cup. The Silktails are now playing in the New South Wales Ron Massey Cup, and there's a pathway for development. So, yeah, it's a really good question. I'm glad the decision's not mine.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah. To be honest with you, to be a national game, understanding the commerciality of the broadcast, the importance, I'd go Perth. Mm-hmm. So if I could go a combination of the Perth Bears,
that would be nice. Yeah,
that's probably what would make the most sense. But I'd have no opposition to the others. I know Andrew Hill's doing a great job, and I love the Papuans, and they would be a wonderful addition to the professional competition on a full-time basis.
Yeah,
it's just the cost and the logistics. Well, if they're not really based in Papua New Guinea, they're based in Cairns, and there's some challenges there, and whether they can attract players and stuff would be interesting. Where the money and all that, the economy comes behind them, I think they've probably got some advantages there with some good, solid financial backing. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You've got to have all the pieces fit. So it's a tough decision for the NRL. I'm glad I'm not making it, because you're not going to please everyone.
It's a tough
Sounds
one.
a bit like politics.
Yeah. Well, 2019, I went to Christchurch and watched the Great Britain played New Zealand and PNG played Fiji as a curtain raiser. I've got a cousin that lives in Christchurch. I've never been before, and I thought, what a wonderful city. Easy to get around. It sort of like has Brisbane vibes about it. Because the earthquake had affected the old stadium, there's a brand new state-of-the-art stadium being built, and I thought, how good would an NRL team be here? Then we've got a North Island and a South Island representation. So I can see the pros and cons for every single option there in the 18th.
Well,
line.
New Zealand and Perth give you the time zone advantage, and I think Papua not that different. I think maybe an hour different.
Yeah, same time as Townsville, would it be?
I'd say so. Yeah, so it's only early in the daylight saving stuff. You may get an advantage there, but you've already got the 4 teams in Queensland now that have got that advantage. So, I think there's pros and cons for all of them, I guess. But I really don't want to be making that decision either. So to keep the wife happy, I'll say the Bears, and just for the time frame factor, I think to make it a bit more of a national game, I think a footprint in Perth, because they've got a really good junior base over there, probably a better domestic, strong pathway sort of growth opportunity there as well.
Yeah.
But it's a tough decision. There's pros and cons for all of them.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, Troy, it's been an absolute pleasure. We could talk for hours, but I know we can't keep the episode going too long. But no, I really appreciate your time coming on the show today, and all the best with the international calendar. And I hope everything goes really well for leading into the next World Cup as well.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me, and thanks for having me on Beers with Brownie.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.